The air above Europe was thin, cold, and endless. It smelled of oil, sweat, and fear. Every morning, hundreds of young men climbed into the bellies of silver bombers lined up on fog-covered runways. They were barely 20, yet they carried the weight of a world at war. The engines of the B-17 Flying Fortress began to roar in unison, shaking the frozen airfields of England. 4 massive propellers spun like steel blades, cutting through the dawn. The noise was deafening, the vibrations bone-deep. The sky, filled with contrails and smoke, was their battlefield. And though they were armed with thousands of pounds of explosives, they were, in truth, fragile. Each bomber carried 10 men. 10 lives dependent on math, metal, and luck. Their mission was simple on paper: to deliver destruction to the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. But in reality it was chaos. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing was bold, almost arrogant. The United States Army Air Forces believed they could win the war by striking only military and industrial targets, factories, refineries, power plants, rail hubs, and avoid civilian casualties. The British, after their own disastrous attempts, had abandoned daylight raids, choosing the safety of night and the cover of darkness. But the Americans believed in accuracy, in science, in the Norden bomb sight, a device they said could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. In those early years, that promise was a dream, not a fact. Wind, clouds, smoke, flak, and sheer distance turned every bomb run into a gamble. A crosswind at altitude could move a falling bomb half a mile off target. A small miscalculation could turn a precision strike into a meaningless crater. The crews joked grimly about pattern bombing, spreading destruction across miles of countryside and hoping something hit the target. The truth was hard. For every bomb that struck a factory, a dozen struck open fields or empty air. Yet the dream of accuracy would not die. Men in flight jackets and engineers in lab coats worked together to chase it. The Norden bomb sight, with its gyroscopes and gears, was a masterpiece of engineering for its time, but it could not think. It assumed still air, steady flight, perfect alignment. But in war nothing was still. The air currents over Europe twisted and shifted like ghosts. The problem wasn't only the bomb sight, it was the geometry of flight itself. The solution, like most breakthroughs, came not from headquarters but from the men who flew. Some bombardiers began to notice patterns. When they adjusted their approach slightly off-center, flying not directly toward the target but at a deliberate angle, their bombs hit closer to where they aimed. They were compensating for the wind without knowing it. A bomb released sideways, into the wind, would fall in a curved path that landed directly on the target once drift was accounted for. It was counterintuitive, dangerous, and brilliant. Flying sideways meant flying exposed. The enemy's anti-aircraft guns were zeroed in on straight approaches. Fighters predicted movement in straight lines. A bomber that came in at an angle disrupted both calculations, the enemy's and its own. It demanded absolute coordination between the pilot, navigator, and bombardier. One mistake and the formation broke apart. But when done right, the results were astonishing. In early 1944, small-scale tests began. Using practice targets over England, bomber crews flew at calculated drift angles based on wind direction. Film cameras mounted under the fuselage recorded the strikes. Analysts back on the ground compared them to conventional drops. The numbers were clear. Accuracy improved threefold. What had been a wide scatter pattern narrowed to a tight ellipse directly over the target. The method wasn't official, not yet. It spread by word of mouth, passed between crews during briefings in mess halls, or in the nervous hours before missions. "Try it sideways," someone would say quietly, tracing a diagonal line across a map. It was innovation born from desperation, from men who had seen too many friends lost for too little gain. The Air Forces eventually took notice. Engineers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Air Technical Service Command began studying the data. Mathematicians worked with film analysts to understand the phenomenon. They realized that traditional bombing assumed a straight vector, ignoring lateral displacement. By incorporating a pre-calculated drift correction, they could neutralize the crosswinds effect. The calculations were simple on paper but deadly in the sky. Every degree of offset meant flying a slightly different path, exposing the formation to unpredictable fire. Bombardiers had to trust their instruments, pilots had to trust the bombardiers, and everyone had to trust the math. It was geometry under fire. The lessons from Schweinfurt proved the need for it. In October 1943, During the second raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers, nearly 600 men, in one day. Those who returned brought back films that revealed the painful truth. Many bombs had missed by hundreds of meters. The factories were damaged but not destroyed. German production resumed within weeks. Precision had failed, and with it, the promise of daylight bombing. The crews who survived demanded answers. They weren't angry, they were determined. They wanted better tools, better methods, anything that could make the sacrifice mean something. Scientists listened. They refined the Norden bomb sight, developed wind drift calculators, and improved training for offset bombing. What had begun as improvisation became doctrine. Sideways bombing, or crosswind bombing as it was later formalized, changed how air war was fought. No longer did bombers approach directly into the target's face. They attacked along the wind, releasing their loads at angles that made sense only to those who understood the invisible forces above the earth. It required more discipline than courage, though courage was still the currency of survival. From the ground, civilians and soldiers alike watched as the silver trails of bombers crossed the sky in diagonal lines. To them it seemed chaotic. To those inside the planes, it was calculated perfection. Bombs dropped not in straight lines but in graceful arcs, slicing through wind layers, compensating for drift that could never be seen. Each mission told the story of evolution, of how human minds adapted to invisible realities. What once depended on chance became the art of controlled falling. Crews learned to think like physicists. They studied wind charts, temperature gradients, even the shape of clouds. The air war was no longer just about courage, it was about knowledge. The Norden bomb sight, once worshipped as a miracle, was finally used as it was meant to be, not as a magic box but as a mathematical instrument. It became part of a larger system. The offset angle, the wind correction, the timing of release. Together, these elements turned the B-17 into a scalpel instead of a hammer. The results spoke for themselves. In 1944 and 1945, American bombing accuracy increased dramatically. During the raids on the Ploiești oil refineries, precision improved by more than 50% compared to earlier attacks. Over Berlin, aircraft flying offset paths reported significantly tighter bomb patterns. The shift was so effective that Luftwaffe analysts later noted the unnatural accuracy of Allied strikes, unaware of the quiet revolution in bombing tactics. It wasn't only about hitting targets. It was about saving lives, both of those in the bombers and, paradoxically, on the ground. More accurate strikes meant fewer missions, fewer bombs, fewer cities destroyed by error. It meant survival, not just victory. Inside the aircraft, life was hell. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Oxygen masks froze. Hands stuck to metal. The noise was constant. Engines, guns, wind, radio chatter. And through it all, the bombardier crouched over his bomb sight, counting seconds, watching the crosshairs drift, waiting for the perfect alignment that would last less than a heartbeat. When he pressed the release, it was an act of trust. Trust in the math, the machinery, and the man beside him. The sight of bombs leaving the bay was both terrifying and beautiful. They fell in slow motion, a chain of dark shapes tumbling through the thin air. Below, the earth looked peaceful, distant, unreal. The moment of release was followed by silence, then by the delayed bloom of explosions far below. The men never saw the full result, only the flash, the smoke, the rising clouds. Every mission carried a cost. Flak shells burst in black puffs around the formation, their shock waves shaking the planes like toys. The smell of cordite filled the cabins. Shrapnel tore through aluminum, cutting through everything in its path. Each second in enemy airspace was a lifetime. And yet, amidst that chaos, precision was born. It was not a gift of technology but of persistence. The idea of flying sideways, once mocked, became standard practice. Training manuals incorporated drift correction. Simulators were adjusted. Crews learned to think in angles, not lines. By late 1944, the technique was used in nearly every major bombing raid over Europe. Instructors at air bases in England and Italy taught the concept as offset bombing. The results were undeniable. Fewer sorties required to achieve the same level of destruction. War was, by nature, a brutal equation, but this innovation shifted the balance toward efficiency and survival. Historians later called it one of the quiet revolutions of air warfare. Unlike the atomic bomb or the jet engine, it had no single inventor, no headline. It was born from observation, refined by experience and proven by loss. It was the kind of progress that could only come from men who refused to accept imperfection, even in the face of death. As 1945 approached, the lessons of sideways bombing were carried across the Pacific. The B-29 Superfortress, a technological marvel of its time, used similar offset techniques during raids on Japan. Wind over the Japanese islands was unpredictable, driven by jet streams that were still poorly understood. The offset method compensated, allowing for greater accuracy even from altitudes above 30,000 feet. The crews who once doubted the technique now swore by it. They trusted numbers over instinct, calculation over guesswork. Their survival depended on it. Many of them didn't live to see the end of the war, but their innovation changed the future of aerial warfare forever. The sky, once ruled by brute force, became a realm of precision. The shift from direct bombing to offset release marked the transition from guesswork to science. It laid the foundation for the guided bombs and targeting systems that would follow in later decades. What began as a desperate adjustment in the cold skies over Europe became the basis of modern military accuracy. The sound of engines faded, but the lessons remained. Every bomb that fell sideways carried with it the story of men who learned to fight the wind, not just the enemy. Their courage was measured not only in missions flown, but in the quiet persistence to make each one count. They were not mathematicians by choice, nor scientists by training. They were airmen, boys turned into men by the roar of engines and the taste of oxygen at 20,000 feet. Their classrooms were the cockpits of bombers. Their teachers were wind and fire. When historians look back on the air war, they often speak of the great battles: Berlin, Dresden, Tokyo. But within those stories lies a smaller, quieter victory, the moment humanity learned to master the invisible. The sideways drops that tripled accuracy were not born of genius alone, but of necessity, suffering, and an unyielding belief that precision was possible, even in the chaos of war. The cold skies above Europe hold no sound now. But if one listens closely to the old footage, one can almost hear the voices carried by static radio waves, the drone of engines, the calm of a bombardier counting seconds before release. It is in those moments, when men fought both nature and time, that the future of modern warfare was written. The winter of 1944 turned the skies of Europe into a gray sea of turbulence and death. The air was dense with snow, smoke, and the smell of burned oil. Pilots flying through the overcast clouds could barely see the tips of their wings. The war had reached a scale few could comprehend. Thousands of aircraft filling the air each week, engines echoing across entire continents. Yet within this chaos, the pursuit of accuracy continued. Each mission was not only about destruction. It was about discipline, mathematics, and the relentless will to improve. The offset, or sideways, bombing technique that had once been a field improvisation was now being studied in formal classrooms on British airfields. Young bombardiers sat over chalkboards learning trigonometric tables and vector corrections while the sound of engines rumbled outside. They were told that every degree mattered, every second of release was a question of geometry, not instinct. At high altitude, the difference between life and death was measured in numbers. A 10-degree miscalculation could send bombs half a mile astray. A 2-second delay could turn precision into error. The engineers from the Air Technical Service Command began developing new slide rule devices that allowed crews to compute offset angles more quickly. These were simple mechanical calculators, but they represented a merging of war and science unlike anything before. The U.S. Army Air Forces now considered mathematics a weapon. They distributed wind drift calculators, wind correction charts, and offset templates to every bombardier school. Pilots were trained to trust the process, even when their instincts told them otherwise. The Norden bomb site, once treated as sacred, was no longer worshipped in isolation. It became part of a system: the bomb site, the offset chart, the wind data, and the human hand working together. Crews began to see the battlefield as invisible currents and forces, not just targets on a map. The idea of flying sideways was counterintuitive to most pilots. It went against everything they had been taught. But the data proved irrefutable. Flying across the wind, not against it, canceled the drift. The bomb didn't fall straight down, it traced an invisible diagonal through the moving air. Instructors at air bases across England began testing their students with live practice missions. Bombing ranges near the coast were dotted with markers representing factories and bridges. Crews would approach from one direction using the standard method, and then from an angle using the offset technique. The film analysis showed a stark contrast. The offset runs consistently landed closer to the center. It was no longer a theory, it was a repeatable, teachable method. By the spring of 1944, offset bombing was integrated into operations across Europe. The 91st, 303rd, and 305th bomb groups used it during strikes on targets in France, Belgium, and the Ruhr Valley. After-action reports recorded increased hit probabilities and more efficient fuel used due to fewer repeat missions. The results were not just tactical, they were psychological. Crews began to believe in precision again. After years of frustration and loss, there was hope that science could bring order to chaos. The war, however, did not slow down for innovation. The Luftwaffe was still deadly. German radar-guided flak batteries adapted to new flight paths, filling the air with bursts of shrapnel. Pilots had to weave and shift constantly, holding formation under fire while maintaining perfect offset angles. The tension inside a bomber during a run was unbearable. The bombardier called out headings through the intercom. The pilot adjusted. The navigator counted seconds. The crew waited in silence, knowing that one mistake could scatter the bombs across a city instead of a factory. Above Cologne and Essen, entire formations flew at slight diagonals across the wind. From the ground it looked chaotic, hundreds of planes crisscrossing the sky. But it was, in fact, calculated geometry unfolding in the air. The enemy below, used to straight-line approaches, found it harder to predict paths and aim flak effectively. The offset technique unintentionally became a defense mechanism as well. By breaking predictable trajectories, it reduced the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire. For the crews, precision was a moral duty. Many of them had seen what imprecision meant: burned towns, civilian casualties, wasted lives. They wanted to believe that the bombs they dropped had purpose, that they struck the factories and railways fueling the war, not the homes of ordinary people. The sideways method offered that possibility, a way to make war less blind, if not less brutal. In debriefings after missions, officers compared the bombing photographs taken by reconnaissance planes. The images told a story that words could not. Where once the patterns were wide and scattered, now they clustered tightly around the targets. Rail yards were crippled, bridges severed, refineries set ablaze with surgical accuracy. Commanders, once skeptical, began to insist that all bombardiers train in offset correction. At the same time, technology was catching up to theory. Wind measurement devices installed in aircraft sent real-time drift readings to the navigator's table. These readings could be converted into new angles within minutes. What once required guesswork now had numbers to back it. Every mission became a moving equation. Speed, altitude, wind direction, temperature, and release time, all feeding into the moment of truth when the bombs left the bay. The war in the air had always been a balance between chaos and control. Offset bombing tilted that balance toward control. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces advanced after D-Day, bomber formations provided relentless support from above. Factories, rail lines, and communication centers deep within Germany were systematically destroyed. And though the war was far from over, the rhythm of victory was changing. Inside the bombers, the human struggle continued. Men wrote letters home during night shifts, folded them carefully, and tucked them into their flight jackets. They cleaned their goggles, checked their oxygen lines, and said little. Most missions ended with half the crew silent, not from fear but from exhaustion. The mathematics of war was merciless. Even a perfect bombing run could end in flames. Yet they flew again day after day because they believed that precision meant progress. The sideways approach required more than just calculation. It demanded unity. The pilot and bombardier became one mind, synchronized in thought and motion. Every degree mattered. When the bombardier said left drift 3 degrees, the pilot adjusted without hesitation. The plane, the men, and the math were connected by trust. It was teamwork refined to a science. In the training fields, instructors began to teach the philosophy behind precision. They told their students that bombs were not weapons. They were instruments of strategy. Every accurate strike shortened the war. Every missed one extended it. The younger crews absorbed these lessons with quiet resolve. Many of them would never return, but their skill would redefine how nations fought from the air. As autumn approached, the offset technique evolved even further. Engineers integrated it into mechanical analog computers that automatically adjusted the bomb sight for drift angles. This reduced the mental load on bombardiers and increased accuracy under pressure. The Norden bomb sight, long seen as the symbol of precision, became only one piece in a much larger system of calculations. For the first time, man and machine worked together seamlessly in the pursuit of scientific destruction. The method proved so effective that by late 1944, Bomber Command incorporated it into mission planning doctrine. Offset headings were calculated in advance for every target based on meteorological data. Winds aloft were charted from weather balloons and reconnaissance aircraft. The skies were no longer unpredictable. They were mapped, measured, and conquered mathematically. But war has a way of humbling even the most brilliant ideas. The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought the Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Weather grounded bombers for weeks. Crews waited helplessly as the ground forces fought in the snow. Precision meant nothing without visibility. When the skies finally cleared, the air forces unleashed the full power of their new methods. Offset raids targeted rail lines and fuel depots feeding the German advance. Reports from the front confirmed their success. The strikes were accurate, devastating, and timely. It was one of the few times when aerial precision directly changed the course of a battle. Still, each success carried the shadow of loss. Flak and fighters claimed hundreds of bombers in those final months. Even as accuracy improved, the cost remained unbearable. The sideways technique could not protect against steel and fire. Yet those who survived knew that it had given their missions meaning. The men in the air were not blind instruments. They were craftsmen of precision, building a new form of warfare one calculation at a time. By the beginning of 1945, the offset bombing method was exported beyond Europe. Across the Pacific, the B-29 Superfortress took to the skies. The jet stream winds over Japan were fierce, up to 200 miles per hour, and conventional bombing was nearly impossible. The same principle that saved accuracy over Europe now saved entire missions over Tokyo. Crews used drift charts and offset angles to deliver bombs with unprecedented precision despite the unpredictable jet streams. It was the same geometry now applied at 30,000 feet over the Pacific. From Europe to Asia, the concept of controlling the invisible had transformed warfare. The offset method was a quiet revolution, not dramatic, not heroic in appearance, but deeply human. It proved that knowledge and observation could conquer even the unseen hand of nature. And while the world would soon see more devastating weapons, few innovations matched the elegance and logic of that diagonal flight path that defied the wind. The end of the war approached. The skies began to clear of contrails and smoke. The airfields of England grew silent. The men who had once filled the sky returned home, older than their years, changed in ways they could not explain. For them, precision had not been about pride or numbers. It had been about survival. To hit the target meant fewer missions, fewer losses, fewer empty bunks in the barracks. Historians would later call this era the birth of modern aerial science. What began as intuition in the frozen cockpit of a B-17 became the foundation for ballistic computation, guided weaponry, and satellite navigation. Every click of a bomb sight wheel, every angle corrected against the wind, was a step toward the precision that defined the second half of the 20th century. Even decades later, the veterans who gathered at reunions would still draw diagrams on napkins, showing young listeners how the plane had to fly sideways to hit the target dead center. They would smile faintly as they remembered the sound of engines, the trembling of the airframe, and the calm of the bombardier's voice counting down the seconds. They did not speak of glory. They spoke of mathematics, of wind, of the strange satisfaction of getting it right. For those who lived through it, the sideways drop was not just a technical adjustment. It was a symbol of human ingenuity under pressure. It proved that even in the most brutal conditions imaginable, men could still think, learn, and adapt. The bombs they dropped changed history, but the knowledge they gained changed the future. The world remembers wars through victories and defeats, but history's true legacy often lies in the small, quiet changes that alter everything. The decision to fly at an angle, to defy the wind instead of fight it, was one such change. It began with observation, matured through science, and ended as one of the most significant leaps in the history of warfare. The sideways bombing technique was more than strategy. It was philosophy, the belief that precision is not a gift, but a discipline earned through courage, intelligence, and respect for the laws of nature. And when the engines of the last bombers finally fell silent, the lessons they had taught the world did not vanish with the sound. They lingered, in the hum of jet engines, in the computer circuits that now guide missiles, in every instrument that measures wind, drift, and trajectory. The ghosts of those airmen still fly, not in the clouds, but in the calculations that define every flight taken since. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. The smoke over Europe lifted slowly, revealing cities that no longer had shapes, only shadows. The airfields that once thundered with engines were quiet now, littered with the skeletons of aircraft that would never fly again. The men who had filled the sky returned home, their uniforms faded, their eyes older than their years. They brought back not trophies or pride, but a kind of knowledge that few could understand. The sideways bombing technique, the act of flying against instinct, trusting mathematics to conquer the wind, had changed not only the war but the very nature of how humans approach precision itself. Engineers gathered in quiet offices, surrounded by charts and reels of combat film. They studied every detail: wind speed, drift angles, bomb trajectories, patterns of explosions. They were no longer at war, but their minds still fought the chaos of the air. The lessons learned above Europe were too valuable to forget. The method of offset bombing became a cornerstone for a new science: ballistic computation. It was no longer about hitting factories, it was about understanding the universe of motion. In the early years after the war, military laboratories in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union began converting wartime techniques into post-war doctrine. What the bomber crews had done instinctively, engineers now turned into equations. The principles of offset release evolved into new instruments that could automatically compensate for wind and rotation. These ideas became the seeds of the first guided systems, devices that could predict and correct their own paths. What once required courage and intuition would soon be performed by machines. Yet for those who had lived through it, the memories were not mathematical, they were human. The veterans who attended reunions in the late 1940s spoke quietly of the missions that still haunted their sleep. Many of them could recall, with terrifying clarity, the moment of release, the shudder of the aircraft, the sudden lightness, the brief silence before the sound of explosions reached them through the thin air. They spoke not of victories but of precision, of the small triumph of doing something exactly right in a world that seemed built for chaos. For them, the sideways drop was not just a tactic, it was a way of surviving the impossible. As technology advanced, the lessons of those bombers found new homes. The Korean War erupted in 1950, and the skies once again filled with American aircraft. But the nature of bombing had changed. Jet engines carried planes faster and higher than ever before. The same principles of offset bombing were now calculated by onboard analog computers. No longer did a bombardier lean over a mechanical sight with frozen fingers. Now, dials and gyroscopes made the corrections automatically. The idea remained the same: correct for the wind, drop at an angle, trust the math. But the human drama had shifted behind panels of blinking lights. In Korea, where mountains and unpredictable winds challenged even the most advanced pilots, the lessons from Europe returned like an old friend. Pilots who had once flown B-17s now sat in B-29s, remembering how to trust the diagonal path. Reports from the early years of the war noted the same benefits: greater accuracy, fewer wasted sorties, and a deepened respect for scientific discipline. It was the same invisible geometry now guided by new tools. Meanwhile, in research centers across the world, a quiet race began. The Cold War transformed knowledge into weaponry. The simple concept of offset compensation became part of every missile guidance system, every targeting computer, every radar correction. The scientists who once drew drift angles on maps now designed algorithms for rockets. What began with a bombardier's intuition in a freezing cockpit became the logic that guided humanity's deadliest machines. And yet, beneath the progress, a question lingered: what was the moral weight of precision? During the war, accuracy had been a promise, to strike the enemy, not the innocent. But as technology advanced, precision made destruction effortless. The same mathematics that once saved lives by reducing errors could now erase entire cities with a single button. The airmen who had dreamed of order now watched a new generation build weapons that removed human hands from the act entirely. Historians began to write about the paradox of precision. They noted that the sideways bombing technique marked the moment when warfare ceased to be about strength and became about calculation. It was the birth of the scientific battlefield. The wind, once an enemy, was now just a variable. The human factor, error, fear, hesitation, was slowly engineered out. But with it went something else: the understanding of consequence. In the 1950s, as the United States developed intercontinental bombers and nuclear payloads, the lessons of the Norden bombsight and the offset method were rewritten into new forms. The B-47 and B-52 crews were trained not only in flight but in geometry and physics. The diagrams from the Second World War, lines showing wind drift and angles of approach, appeared again in manuals, this time labeled automatic correction algorithms. The same principle applied: flight at an offset, correction for motion, impact on target. The difference was scale. One bomb no longer destroyed a factory, it could erase a city. Some of the old airmen were invited to consult on these programs. They sat in polished conference rooms, surrounded by young engineers who spoke in formulas. When they described how they once flew sideways through flak to drop bombs with accuracy, the younger men nodded politely. They respected the experience, but they lived in a new era, one where no human would ever have to look through a bomb sight again. The veterans didn't envy them. They understood something the machines did not: precision is not perfection. Every calculation, no matter how exact, carried a shadow of uncertainty. The wind, the air, the world itself would never be fully predictable. And in that space of unpredictability, humanity still existed. In archives across the United States, films from wartime missions were analyzed frame by frame. Researchers from universities and the newly formed RAND Corporation used them to model ballistics, atmospheric drag, and dispersion. They called it operational research, but the roots were clear. The sideways path of a bomb through a moving wind became a symbol of applied science, an early form of data-driven decision-making. It influenced not just military tactics but civil engineering, meteorology, and aerospace design. The connection between those bombers and the future of flight was direct. The same men who calculated offset angles would later help launch satellites. The same formulas used to correct for wind drift became part of orbital mechanics. When the first rockets pierced the atmosphere, they too had to fly sideways, to account for Earth's rotation, to curve their path into orbit. The logic of the offset lived on, no longer as destruction but as exploration. Back on Earth, the survivors aged quietly. They rarely spoke of the technical triumphs. To them, the war was not a laboratory, it was a memory stitched with loss. They remembered the cold of the oxygen mask, the smell of burning oil, the faces that didn't come back. The sideways drop was, in their minds, not a symbol of innovation but of perseverance. They had learned to fight the wind because they had no choice. As the decades passed, museums began to collect their stories. In small rooms lined with faded photographs, the veterans would explain to visitors how a bomber had to fly slightly sideways to hit its target. They would draw it with shaking hands, one line for the wind, one for the path, one for the fall. The visitors, often children, nodded politely, unable to imagine what it felt like to balance fear and mathematics at 20,000 feet. Documentaries and historians began to rediscover their significance. The story of offset bombing was not glamorous. It lacked heroes, battles, and explosions, but it was a story of minds under pressure. It represented the triumph of logic over chaos. When future generations watched footage of B-17s crossing the sky, few realized that those aircraft were not flying directly at their targets. They were flying diagonally, unseen angles calculated by invisible men. In time, the technique was forgotten by name but not by influence. The idea of compensating for invisible forces became a foundation for every precision system on Earth. From artillery to satellites, from guided drones to autonomous vehicles, the logic of correction, the trust in calculated imperfection, was the legacy of those airmen. They had taught the world that to hit something exactly, you must never fly straight at it. In classrooms decades later, professors of aeronautics would sometimes mention the old bombing methods as historical footnotes. But for those who had been there, it was never history, it was a memory of survival. They could still see the faces of the crew in the glow of the instrument lights, hear the hum of the engines, feel the trembling of the airframe as flak burst outside. And always, in that moment before release, they would remember the quiet voice of the bombardier counting down. 3, 2, 1, drop. The bombs would fall silently at first, then whistle, then vanish into smoke. Below them, the earth would erupt in fire, but in the minds of the men above, the true explosion was not of destruction but of understanding. They had mastered something invisible. They had proven that knowledge could bend the wind. As the 20th century moved into its second half, precision became a philosophy. Engineers built systems to measure everything: motion, pressure, temperature, error. The dream of accuracy that had driven those wartime crews became the foundation of the digital age. Computers were born from the same obsession with eliminating uncertainty. The first flight simulators, the first radar displays, even the early programming languages carried echoes of that old pursuit. Control the uncontrollable. The old bombers rusted away in museums and airfields, but their influence spread into every discipline. When spacecraft navigated to the moon, they used the same compensations for drift. When scientists launched weather balloons into the stratosphere, they charted winds the same way bomber crews once did. The world had changed, but the equation remained the same. The men who had trusted mathematics over instinct became symbols of a generation that believed knowledge could save the world. They had lived through an age where every mistake was fatal, where every calculation had a face attached to it. Their pursuit of accuracy was not abstract, it was survival. They had learned that precision was not a luxury but a form of mercy. Even as technology advanced, their lesson endured. Precision without purpose is meaningless. The sideways flight path was not just about hitting a target, it was about choosing how to face the wind. It was about refusing to let chaos decide the outcome. That idea, simple, human, eternal, outlived the war that created it. When the war ended, the world was silent for the first time in years. The smoke cleared, but the memories did not. The sky, once filled with silver bombers, was now empty. The airfields of England and Italy were quiet except for the wind moving through rusted hangars. Rows of B-17s and B-24s sat abandoned, their aluminum skins reflecting the gray light of peace. The men who once filled them were home now, scattered across farms, towns, and cities. Some became teachers, some engineers, some simply fathers trying to forget the sound of engines that never left their ears. They had returned to a world that no longer looked the same. The precision they had fought for in the air now shaped the world on the ground. The war had turned engineers into philosophers, scientists into humanists. Every calculation they made over Europe was now part of a new question. How can knowledge, once used for destruction, be turned toward life? Many of the airmen never spoke of what they had done. They built quiet lives, worked ordinary jobs, and raised children who never knew that their fathers had once flown through fire. But sometimes, on summer evenings when the wind was right and a plane crossed the sky, they would look up and remember the feeling of flying sideways, of fighting both nature and fate. The sideways bombing technique, forgotten by textbooks, lived on in the foundations of modern flight. Its legacy could be found in every cockpit and every computer that calculated the movement of wind, drag, and gravity. The invisible angles that once guided bombs now guided satellites and aircraft that circled the Earth in peace. What began as an act of war became a map for the future. In the 1960s, as the world reached for the stars, the same mathematics that once calculated drift correction for a bomb now calculated trajectory correction for a spacecraft. The same diagrams of offset paths reappeared, this time with the name orbital insertion. Engineers who had studied wartime reports recognized the geometry immediately. The curve that once guided destruction now carried humanity into the heavens. The moral weight of precision grew heavier with each decade. During the Cold War, when nuclear bombers replaced propeller planes, the dream of perfect accuracy became both salvation and terror. The same mathematics that once saved the lives of aircrews now held the power to erase entire cities. Precision had become absolute, and with it, responsibility. The old airmen who lived long enough to see this felt both pride and unease. They had proven that knowledge could master the wind, but now they saw that knowledge, without conscience, could master everything else too. In their later years, they began to tell their stories not as warriors but as witnesses. They spoke of the sound of frost crackling on the wings, of the silence before a drop, of the strange peace that came from getting the numbers right even when everything else was chaos. They said that what they remembered most was not fear but focus, that in the moment of release when time stood still they felt something like clarity. Museums began recording their testimonies. Archivists unearthed their flight logs, diagrams, and bomb site manuals. Historians realized that behind the statistics of the air war lay something profound, the birth of a new relationship between man and machine. The airmen were not just soldiers. They were the first generation to live between intuition and computation, between the human heartbeat and the rhythm of mathematics. When they explained the offset bombing method to younger audiences, their words were simple. "You never fly straight," they said. "If you want to hit the target, you must fly a little sideways." It was advice that carried meaning far beyond war. It was a metaphor for life itself, that to reach what you aim for, you must understand the forces that try to push you off course. Some of those men lived long enough to see their grandchildren fly in airplanes guided entirely by computers. The new machines corrected for wind automatically, adjusted course in milliseconds, and landed without human touch. Yet the principle was the same: compensation, correction, precision. The ghosts of the old bombers still lived in the algorithms. In one interview recorded in the 1980s, an elderly bombardier was asked what he felt during those missions. He smiled faintly and said, "We weren't heroes. We were just men trying to understand the wind." That sentence became the closing line of a museum exhibit in Dayton, Ohio, the birthplace of flight. Visitors stood before a display showing a Norden bomb site, its glass still scratched from frost, and read those words beneath it. As the century ended, the skies changed again. Satellites replaced bombers, drones replaced pilots, and precision became something invisible, silent, and constant. But the principle that began with the sideways flight still ruled everything that moved through the air: correction, adjustment, understanding. The invisible angles remained, the legacy of minds that refused to accept the randomness of nature. Every pilot who looks at a crosswind landing, every engineer who calibrates a missile trajectory, every astronaut who aligns an orbital burn owes something to those young men who once flew through the cold skies of Europe. Their pursuit of precision became humanity's pursuit of mastery. And though their war is over, their lesson endures: that progress is built not on power but on understanding. In the modern world, where computers calculate what once took lives to learn, it is easy to forget that every equation had a price. Every formula was written by someone who faced death to prove it. The mathematics of precision was bought with courage, fear, and sacrifice. And when we speak of technology today, of guidance, stability, and control, we are really speaking of them. The world they help build is safer, more predictable, and infinitely more precise. But it is also haunted by their silence. They did not speak of glory, only of gravity. They did not boast of victories, only of lessons. Their legacy is not carved in stone but written in the sky, in every contrail that bends slightly against the wind. In their old age, they gathered one last time at airfields turned into museums. They touched the wings of the planes they had flown decades before. The aluminum felt colder now, quieter. Some placed their hands on the worn edges of the Norden bomb site, whispering that it had been both their burden and their salvation. They looked out across the runways where the wind still moved, remembering how they once measured it, fought it, and finally learned to fly with it. When they spoke, their voices trembled but their words were clear. They said that war had taught them one truth: that knowledge is the only weapon that saves as much as it destroys. That to master the wind, one must first respect it. And that even in the darkest sky, precision is not the opposite of chaos, but the light that shines through it. Their story does not end with the war. It continues in every pilot who checks his instruments, in every engineer who tests a new design, in every scientist who looks up and wonders how the air moves. The wind has not changed. It still pushes, still resists, still teaches. The lesson of those who flew sideways remains: to reach your goal, you must understand the forces you cannot see. As time carried them away, their names faded, but their work did not. The world they helped shape learned to live with precision, in medicine, in flight, in thought itself. The act of measuring, of correcting, of striving for accuracy became the heartbeat of progress. And though few remember their names, every heartbeat of technology still carries their rhythm. Now, decades later, when a passenger plane glides through the clouds on autopilot, when a satellite sends a signal across the earth, when a drone lands with perfect accuracy on a distant field, the spirit of those airmen lives on. Their courage transformed not only war but science, not only destruction but discovery. The sideways flight, that simple, brilliant defiance of the wind, became the path by which humanity learned to master motion itself. And when we look up at the sky today, clear and calm, we see not only clouds and light but echoes of the past, invisible trails of courage, calculation, and sacrifice. The sky remembers. Every gust of wind that bends the air carries the memory of men who once fought to understand it. Their story is not one of glory or conquest. It is a story of learning, of how human beings, faced with the chaos of nature and the cruelty of war, chose to think instead of surrender. They found order in disorder, direction in drift, and meaning in mathematics. They proved that intelligence is humanity's greatest form of bravery. The world moves forward, faster and quieter than ever before, but the principle remains the same. Never fly straight into the wind. Know it, respect it, correct for it. In that philosophy lies the soul of progress, born not from arrogance but from understanding. So when you watch old footage of those bombers, silver dots gliding through clouds, their wings trembling under the weight of purpose, remember this: every one of them flew slightly sideways, guided by unseen hands that believed knowledge could overcome chaos. And in a way they were right. Because the world we live in now, balanced, measured, and precise, is built on their invisible angle. Their story deserves to be remembered, not as a tale of machines but of minds. Minds that looked at the wind, the enemy, and death itself and said, "We can calculate this. We can understand it. We can do better." That quiet defiance, that faith in reason, is what built the future. And as the last of those airmen faded into history, their lesson remained, not carved on monuments but written in equations, in flight paths, in every moment when human beings choose knowledge over chaos. They did not only fight a war. They taught us how to think under pressure, how to aim when the world itself was moving, and how to find truth in turbulence. Their legacy is the silence after the engines stop, the peace that precision made possible. If you've listened this far, remember them. Remember the men who flew sideways through the storm so the world could learn to fly straight through the future. And if this story moved you, if you believe their courage deserves to live on, subscribe to the channel so their voices, their knowledge, and their invisible paths in the sky will never be forgotten.